Rescuers find German Shepherd in the middle of the ocean. How it got there will leave you speechless. In the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a fishing trawler bobbed gently under the morning sun. Captain Jack Hansen stood at the helm, his weathered hands guiding the vessel through the tranquil waters. His crew, a motley group of seasoned fishermen, busied themselves with their daily tasks. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the deck. "Man overboard!" Jack rushed to the railing, his heart pounding. But as he scanned the water, he realized it wasn't a man at all. There, thrashing desperately in the waves, was a dog, a German Shepherd. "Bring her in, boys," Jack commanded. The crew sprang into action, lowering a net into the water. Gently, they hauled the exhausted creature aboard. The dog collapsed on the deck, its fur matted with seawater. It was a female, Jack noted, and judging by her swollen teats, a nursing mother. But what was she doing out here, miles from land? As if in answer, the dog lifted her head weakly and let out a plaintive whine. In that moment, Jack saw in her eyes a depth of sorrow and betrayal that made his heart ache. Something terrible had happened to this dog. And Jack was determined to find out what. Hundreds of miles away, in the coastal town of Bayville, a man sat in his dimly lit office, a satisfied smirk on his face. Richard Kane, the town's most notorious landlord, leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. On his desk lay a stack of eviction notices, each representing a life uprooted, a family displaced. But to Kane, they were simply numbers on a spreadsheet, obstacles in his path to wealth and power. A knock at the door interrupted his musings. "Come in," he barked. Two men entered, their faces grim. Kane recognized them as his enforcers, the ones he sent to handle his dirty work. "It's done, boss," the taller one said. "We got rid of the old man's dog, just like you asked." Kane's smirk widened. "Excellent. One less mess to deal with." He had no use for sentimentality. When that stubborn old fool, Henry Wilson, had refused to vacate his property, Kane knew he needed to send a message. And what better way than to take the one thing the man loved most in this world? "You should have seen it," the other enforcer chuckled. "Damn mutt nearly took a chunk out of Mike's leg before we could get it into the sack. Put up a hell of a fight." Kane waved his hand dismissively. Yes, spare me the details. The important thing is, it's gone, and Wilson will soon follow." He took a sip of his scotch, savoring the burn. Soon, very soon, the Wilson property would be his. And then, nothing would stand in the way of his vision for Bayville, a vision of luxury condos and high-end boutiques, a playground for the rich and powerful. And if a few worthless mutts had to disappear along the way? Well, that was just the cost of doing business. Miles away, in a cozy cottage nestled among the dunes, Henry Wilson sat in his favorite armchair, his eyes fixed on the front door. He had been sitting there for hours, waiting for a familiar bark, the patter of paws on the hardwood floor. But Max never came. Henry's heart clenched with worry. It wasn't like Max to wander off. The loyal German Shepherd had been his constant companion for the past 10 years, ever since he'd retired from the military. Together, they'd weathered the ups and downs of life, the loss of Henry's wife, the long, lonely nights when the memories of the war would come rushing back. Through it all, Max had been there, a steadfast presence, a reminder that Henry was loved. And now, she was gone. Henry heaved himself out of the chair, his joints aching with age and worry. He shuffled to the window, peering out at the quiet street. Deep down, he knew something was wrong. Max wouldn't just leave him like this. But what could have happened? His mind drifted to the letter he'd received last week, the eviction notice from Kane Realty. The thought of losing his home, the one place that held all his memories, was almost too much to bear. But losing Max? That was unthinkable. Henry closed his eyes, sending up a silent prayer. "Please," he whispered. "Please bring her back to me." Little did he know, hundreds of miles away, his prayer was about to be answered, but not in the way he ever could have imagined. Dr. Sophie Carter looked up from her microscope, rubbing her tired eyes. She'd been in the marine biology lab since dawn, analyzing samples from the bay. As she stretched, her gaze fell on the framed photo on her desk, a picture of her grandfather, a kind-faced man with twinkling eyes. He had been a fisherman, just like his father before him, and his father before that. It was her grandfather who had instilled in Sophie a deep love for the sea and all its creatures. He had taught her to respect the delicate balance of the ecosystem, to understand that every living thing, no matter how small, had a part to play. And now, as a marine biologist, Sophie had made it her life's mission to protect that balance, to be a voice for the voiceless. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. "Come in," she called. The door swung open, revealing her lab assistant, a bright-eyed graduate student named Liam. "Dr. Carter, you're not going to believe this," he said breathlessly. "We just got a call from a fishing boat. They found a dog out in the middle of the ocean." Sophie's eyebrows shot up. "A dog? Are you sure?" Liam nodded vigorously. "They're bringing it to the harbor now. Thought you'd want to know." Sophie grabbed her coat, her mind already racing. A dog, miles offshore? It didn't make sense. But if there was one thing Sophie had learned in her years of studying the sea, it was that the ocean was full of mysteries. And this was one mystery she was determined to solve. The sun was setting over the harbor as Sophie and Liam arrived, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. The fishing boat was already docked, its crew milling about on the deck. Sophie strode up the gangplank, Liam trailing behind. "I'm Dr. Carter," she called out. "I heard you found a dog?" A grizzled man in a captain's hat stepped forward, his face creased with concern. "That we did, ma'am," he said. "Strangest thing I've seen in all my years at sea." He led her to a corner of the deck where the dog lay, wrapped in a blanket. Sophie knelt down, her heart breaking at the sight. The dog was clearly exhausted, her fur matted with salt water. But what struck Sophie most were her eyes, deep, soulful eyes that seemed to hold a world of pain. "Hey there, girl," Sophie murmured, gently stroking the dog's head. "What happened to you?" The dog whimpered softly, pressing her nose into Sophie's hand. And in that moment, Sophie knew she would do whatever it took to help this poor creature. She turned to the captain. "Do you have any idea how she ended up out there?" The captain shook his head. "None at all. We were miles from shore when we spotted her. It's a miracle she was still alive." Sophie's mind raced with possibilities. Had the dog fallen overboard from another boat? Or had she been deliberately abandoned, left to the mercy of the sea? She looked down at the dog again, her resolve hardening. "We need to get her to a vet," she said. "And then, we're going to find out who did this to her." Liam nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the call. Sophie stayed with the dog, murmuring words of comfort. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The rescue of this one dog was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change the lives of everyone involved. And at the center of it all, a lonely old man sat in his cottage, waiting for a miracle. News of the rescued dog spread quickly through the small town of Bayville. Locals gathered at the harbor, murmuring amongst themselves as Sophie and Liam carefully loaded the exhausted animal into their car. At the veterinary clinic, Dr. Nina Patel was waiting. She ushered them into an examination room, her face etched with concern. "Let's take a look at you, sweet girl," she murmured, gently lifting the dog onto the table. As Dr. Patel examined her, Sophie hovered nearby, her mind spinning with questions. Who could have done such a thing? And why? Suddenly, Dr. Patel let out a gasp. "Oh my," she breathed. "Sophie, look at this." She pointed to the dog's left ear. There, barely visible under the matted fur, was a small tattoo, a series of numbers and letters. Sophie leaned in, her eyes widening. "Is that a military ID number?" Dr. Patel nodded. "I've seen these before. This dog was a service animal, probably for a veteran." Sophie's heart clenched. The thought of someone abandoning their loyal companion, after all they'd been through together, it was almost too much to bear. She looked at the dog, her eyes brimming with tears. "We'll find your person," she whispered. "I promise." As if in response, the dog let out a soft whine, her tail thumping weakly against the table. Sophie turned to Liam. "We need to put out a notice, see if anyone in town is missing a service dog." He nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll get right on it." Dr. Patel continued her examination, her brow furrowed. "She's dehydrated and malnourished, but otherwise, she seems to be in good health. A few days of rest and care, and she should be back on her feet." Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. We'll make sure she gets the best care possible." As they left the clinic, Sophie's mind was already racing ahead. Somewhere out there was a person missing their faithful companion, and she was determined to bring them back together. What Sophie didn't know was that the dog's owner was closer than she thought, and that his story was about to intertwine with hers in ways she never could have imagined. Henry sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. It had been 3 days since Max had disappeared, and with each passing hour, his hope dwindled. He'd searched everywhere: the beach, the woods, the streets of town. He'd knocked on every door, shown Max's picture to anyone who would listen. But it was as if she had vanished into thin air. Henry's eyes drifted to the stack of bills on the table, the eviction notice sitting on top like a cruel taunt. Without Max, the thought of losing his home seemed almost unbearable. Suddenly, a knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. Henry's heart leapt. Could it be? He hurried to the door, throwing it open. But instead of Max's familiar face, he found himself staring at a young woman with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Mr. Wilson," she asked softly. "My name is Sophie Carter. I think I might have found your dog." Henry's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Max," he whispered. "You found Max?" Sophie nodded, her smile widening. "She's at the vet clinic in town. She's a little worse for wear, but she's going to be okay." Tears streamed down Henry's withered cheeks. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you so much." Sophie reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "There's something else you should know," she said. "We think Max was deliberately abandoned. Someone threw her into the ocean and left her to die." Henry's eyes widened with shock, then narrowed with fury. "Who would do such a thing?" he growled. Sophie hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Mr. Wilson, I know about the eviction notice. I think whoever did this to Max was trying to send you a message." Henry's hands clenched into fists. "Kane," he spat. "That bastard's been trying to get his hands on my property for years." Sophie's eyes flashed with determination. "We're not going to let him get away with this," she said firmly. "Max survived for a reason. She's a fighter, just like you." Henry looked at this young woman, this stranger who had brought his beloved dog back to him. And for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. "What do we do now?" he asked. Sophie smiled, a fierce, determined smile. "Now," she said, "we fight back." Word of Max's rescue and the suspicions surrounding her abandonment spread like wildfire through Bayville. The town was abuzz with rumors and speculation. At the center of it all, Richard Kane sat in his office, his jaw clenched tight. He had underestimated the old man's dog, and now his carefully laid plans were unraveling. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he snapped. His secretary entered, her face pale. "Mr. Kane, there's a crowd gathering outside," she said nervously. "They're demanding answers about the dog." Kane's eyes narrowed. He strode to the window, peering down at the street below. Sure enough, a crowd had formed, angry faces, homemade signs, chants of justice for Max. At the front of the crowd, he spotted a familiar figure, that meddling marine biologist, Sophie Carter. And beside her, leaning heavily on a cane, was Henry Wilson. Kane's lip curled in a sneer. So, the old man had found himself an ally. No matter. He had dealt with far worse than a bleeding heart scientist and a broken-down veteran. He turned back to his secretary. "Call the police," he ordered. "Have them disperse this rabble." She hesitated, then nodded, scurrying out of the room. Kane settled back into his chair, his mind already spinning with new plans. He would not be defeated by a dog and a handful of do-gooders. Bayville was his town, and he would do whatever it took to keep it that way. Meanwhile, across town, Sophie and Henry sat in the vet clinic, Max resting comfortably between them. The dog's tail thumped lazily as they stroked her fur, marveling at her resilience. "I can't believe she survived," Henry murmured. "All those miles, all that time in the water." Sophie nodded, her eyes distant. "She's a miracle," she said softly. "And she's going to help us bring Kane to justice." Henry looked up, his eyes searching her face. "Do you really think we can do it?" he asked. "Kane's a powerful man. He has the whole town in his pocket." Sophie met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. "We have to try," she said. "For Max, and for everyone else who suffered under his greed." She reached out, clasping Henry's hand in hers. "We're not alone in this," she said. "The whole town is behind us. Together, we can make a difference." Henry looked down at their joined hands, then at Max, her steady presence a beacon of hope. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Sophie and Henry, along with a growing group of supporters, worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Richard Kane. They interviewed former tenants, piecing together a pattern of intimidation and coercion. They dug through public records, uncovering shady business deals and questionable permits. And all the while, Max was there, a constant reminder of the stakes they were fighting for. The dog had become a symbol of hope for the town, a rallying cry for justice. But Kane was not one to go down without a fight. He lashed out at his accusers, using his money and influence to smear their reputations. He hired high-powered lawyers, threatening anyone who dared to speak out against him. And then, just when it seemed like the pressure was becoming too much to bear, a breakthrough. Sophie burst into Henry's cottage, her eyes shining with excitement. "Henry, you're not going to believe this," she said breathlessly. "We found a witness." Henry's eyebrows shot up. "A witness? To what?" Sophie grinned. "To Max's abandonment. A fisherman on another boat saw the whole thing. He's willing to testify." Henry's heart leapt. With a witness, they had a real chance of bringing Kane to justice. But even as they celebrated this small victory, they knew the fight was far from over. Kane still had power, still had resources. And he would not hesitate to use them. They needed to be smart, strategic, and most of all, united. The town hall was packed to the rafters. It seemed like every resident of Bayville had turned out for the hearing, the fishermen and the shopkeepers, the teachers and the nurses, the young and the old. At the front of the room, Sophie and Henry sat side by side, Max curled at their feet. They had spent hours preparing their case, gathering their evidence, rehearsing their testimonies. But now, in the face of the crowd, in the face of the man who had caused so much pain, they felt a flicker of doubt. Kane sat on the other side of the room, flanked by his team of lawyers. He looked calm, almost bored, as if this were all just a minor inconvenience. The mayor, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, called the hearing to order. "We are here today," he began, "to address the allegations against Mr. Richard Kane and his company, Kane Realty." He turned to Sophie and Henry. "Miss Carter, Mr. Wilson, you have the floor." Sophie stood, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, then began to speak. She told the story of Max's rescue, of the dog's miraculous survival against all odds. She spoke of the tattoo they had found, the proof that Max had been a service animal, a beloved companion. Then, she laid out the evidence they had gathered, the testimonies of former tenants, the records of shady deals, the permits obtained through bribery and coercion. Finally, she called their star witness, the fisherman who had seen Max being thrown from Cain's boat. Throughout it all, Cain sat silently, his face an unreadable mask. But as the evidence mounted, as the crowd began to murmur and whisper, a flicker of unease crossed his features. And then, it was Henry's turn. The old man stood, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the town he had called home for so long. "I've lived in Bayville my whole life," he began, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen this town through good times and bad. I've watched it weather storms and droughts, booms and busts." He paused, his eyes finding Cain's. "But I've never seen anything like the greed and cruelty that Richard Cain has brought to our shores." The room fell silent, hanging on his every word. "He took my home," Henry said, his voice breaking. "He took my dog. He took my dignity. And he did it all for profit, for power." He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each face in turn. But he didn't count on one thing: the strength of this community. The goodness of the people who call Bayville home. He reached down, resting a hand on Max's head. "This dog, she's a survivor. She's a fighter. And she reminds us that we are too." The crowd erupted in applause, in cheers, in shouts of support. And in that moment, Sophie and Henry knew that they had won. Not just the hearing, not just the case, but the hearts and minds of Bayville. The town had united behind them, behind Max, behind the ideals of justice and compassion. And no amount of money, no amount of power, could stand against that. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within days of the hearing, Richard Cain found himself facing a barrage of legal troubles. The district attorney, emboldened by the outpouring of public support, filed charges of animal cruelty, bribery, and racketeering. Cain's investors, seeing the writing on the wall, began to jump ship. His properties fell into foreclosure, his assets seized by the courts. And through it all, the people of Bayville watched with a sense of grim satisfaction. They had taken back their town, rooted out the corruption that had threatened to strangle it. But for Sophie and Henry, the victory was bittersweet. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. There were still countless others like Cain out there, people who put profit over compassion, power over justice. And they knew that it would take more than one dog, one case, to change that. But they also knew that they had started something, a ripple that would spread far beyond the shores of Bayville. They had shown that a small group of determined people could make a difference and could stand up to even the most powerful of foes. And so, as they sat in Henry's cottage, Max curled contentedly at their feet, they began to plan their next move. "We can't stop here," Sophie said, her eyes sparkling with determination. "We have to keep fighting, keep pushing for change." Henry nodded, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "And we will," he said. "For Max, and for all the other Maxes out there." He reached out, taking Sophie's hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly. "For everything." Sophie squeezed his hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. "We did it together," she said. "You, me, Max, and the whole town of Bayville." They sat in silence for a moment, savoring the quiet, the peace that had settled over the town. And then, Max let out a low bark, her tail thumping against the floor. Sophie and Henry laughed, the sound echoing through the cottage. It was a sound of joy, of hope, of a future that suddenly seemed so much brighter. A future where compassion and kindness could triumph over greed and cruelty. A future that, thanks to a brave dog and the people who loved her, was finally within reach. Weeks turned into months, and life in Bayville slowly returned to normal, or at least, a new normal. The town had been through a crucible, had emerged stronger, more united than ever before. Sophie and Henry found themselves at the center of this new community. They were the heroes of Bayville, the ones who had stood up to Richard Cain and won. But they knew that their work was far from over. They had seen firsthand the suffering that greed and cruelty could cause, the lives that could be ruined in the pursuit of profit. And so, they began to plan, to dream, to imagine a world where such things were no longer possible. It started small, a fundraiser for the local animal shelter, a petition to strengthen animal cruelty laws. But soon, their efforts began to gain momentum, to spread beyond the borders of Bayville. They spoke at conferences, gave interviews, shared Max's story with anyone who would listen. And people did listen, not just in Bayville, but across the country, around the world. Max became a symbol, a rallying cry for all those who believed in the power of compassion, the strength of the human-animal bond. And through it all, Sophie and Henry were there, guiding the movement, lending their voices to the cause. They knew that change wouldn't come easy, that there would be setbacks, obstacles, moments of doubt. But they also knew that they had something more powerful than money or influence on their side. They had hope, they had each other, and they had Max. The dog who had survived against all odds, who had brought a town together, who had sparked a global movement for change. The dog who, even now, sat at their feet, her eyes shining with love and trust, a reminder of all they had fought for, and all they had yet to achieve. Sophie reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch, her tail wagging softly. "You know, Max," Sophie murmured, "I think you might just be the most important dog in the world." Henry chuckled, joining in the petting. "I think you might be right," he said. "But let's not tell her that. We don't want it going to her head." They laughed, the sound mingling with Max's contented sighs. And for a moment, all was right in the world. They knew there would be more fights ahead, more battles to be won. But for now, they had each other, they had Max, and they had the knowledge that they were making a difference. One day, one dog, one act of kindness at a time. Years passed, and the story of Max and the town of Bayville became legend. It was a tale told around campfires and dinner tables, and classrooms and boardrooms, the story of a dog who had brought a community together, who had sparked a movement that changed the world. Sophie and Henry grew old together, their hair graying, their faces lined with the wisdom of years. But their eyes never lost their sparkle, their hearts never lost their fire. They continued to fight, to advocate, to inspire. They built a sanctuary for rescued animals, a place of healing and hope for creatures who had known nothing but cruelty and neglect. They lobbied for stronger laws, harsher punishments for those who would harm the innocent. They spoke out against greed, against corruption, against all the forces that threatened to tear the world apart. And always, Max was there, a constant presence at their side. Even as her muzzle whitened and her steps slowed, her spirit never wavered. She had become more than just a dog, she was a symbol, a beacon, a reminder of the goodness that lived in every heart. And then, one summer evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Max closed her eyes for the last time. Sophie and Henry held her as she slipped away, their tears mingling with her fur. They whispered words of love, of gratitude, of farewell. And as they laid her to rest, beneath a sprawling oak in the sanctuary she had helped to build, they knew that her legacy would live on. And the laws that had been passed, the lives that had been saved, the hearts that had been touched. And the countless animals who would know love and kindness because of the path she had forged. And in the town of Bayville, the community that had rallied around her, that had learned the true meaning of compassion and unity. Sophie and Henry stood hand in hand, gazing out over the sanctuary, over the town that had become their home. "Do you think they'll remember her?" Sophie asked softly. "After we're gone?" Henry smiled, his eyes distant. "I think they'll remember what she taught us," he said. "That one act of kindness, one moment of courage, can change everything." He squeezed Sophie's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what Max gave us. That's what she'll always give us." Sophie nodded, her own heart too full for words. And together, they turned towards home, towards the future that Max had helped to build. A future of hope, of compassion, of the enduring power of the human spirit. A future where every creature, no matter how small or humble, could know the warmth of love and the light of kindness. A future that, thanks to a brave dog and the town that had saved her, was finally, beautifully, within reach. Decades flew by like leaves on the wind, and the world continued to turn. New generations were born, grew, lived, and loved on the shores of Bayville. Sophie and Henry passed on, as all living things must. But their legacy, and Max's, endured. The sanctuary they had built flourished, becoming a model for others around the globe. Countless animals found healing and hope within its walls, learning to trust, to love, to live again. The laws they had fought for became stronger, the punishments for cruelty harsher. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn against those who would harm the innocent. And in Bayville, Max's story became more than just history, it became a part of the town's very soul. Her statue stood in the town square, a tribute to the dog who had changed everything. Children played at its feet, lovers whispered sweet nothings in its shadow, old folks sat and remembered the days when a community had come together to save one of its own. Every year, on the anniversary of Max's rescue, the town would gather to celebrate, to remember, to reaffirm the values that had guided them through their darkest hour. They would tell stories of courage and compassion, of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. They would honor those who had fought for justice, who had given voice to the voiceless. And always, at the center of it all, was Max. The dog who had survived the unsurvivable, who had brought a town to its knees and then lifted it up again. The dog who had taught them the true meaning of love, of kindness, of the indomitable power of the spirit. As the years turned to decades and the decades to centuries, the world continued to change. But in Bayville, one thing remained constant. The memory of a dog and the town that had saved her. A reminder that, in the end, it is not the grandest gestures or the mightiest deeds that change the course of history. It is the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of courage, the unwavering belief in the goodness of the heart. It is the love that binds us, one to another, human and animal alike. And as long as that love endures, as long as there are those willing to fight for it, to defend it, to nurture it, there will always be hope. For Max, for Bayville, and for the world entirely.